know where you want to be. And this point tells you how you want to get there. So kind of like Google Maps we have in the US, I assume, I think well, I've used Google Maps in Japan, so you definitely have Google Maps. So where do you want to be and how do you want to get there? And these two steps, the beginning and the end of the development, are in the hands of fishery managers. So they are in control of those two steps. And importantly, there is stakeholder involvement throughout the process. Stakeholder involvement, we have many different stakeholders on this call today, which is great. And stakeholder involvement is a hallmark of the harvest strategy process. And it's a way, again, to make management much more inclusive. So looking back at this figure of development, we have selecting management objectives as the first step. Then we have an iterative process here. The black is scientists, the blue is managers. And so there's this kind of iterative back and forth in the development process of management strategy evaluation. I should note that there is a lot of flexibility in the order of these steps, but essentially you want to agree to reference points, determine acceptable levels of risk, go through your harvest control rules, and we'll go through each of these steps in subsequent slides. But the point is there is an iterative exchange between scientists and managers, again with stakeholder participation during the MSE development process. We then adopt the harvest strategy and then implement the harvest strategy in this feedback loop that we will also go into. And importantly, just when you adopt a harvest strategy, it's not set in stone forever. Of course, every now and then you evaluate whether your harvest strategy is meeting your objectives. If yes, you keep implementing. If no, you might come back into your MSE and reevaluate things. So looking at management objectives, there are 5 main categories of management objectives that most international fisheries have been looking for. And on the right here, I won't read these, but on the right here are the management objectives that are currently under consideration for North Atlantic swordfish. So the first category is status, stock status. You want the fishery to be, the population to be at a healthy level. Then safety objectives say that you want to avoid a dangerously low level of the population. Yield, of course, maximizing catch is an objective. Abundance is not always used. You'll see there's no abundance objective on the right here for swordfish. But abundance is often used to, for example, maximize catch rates. If the population is more abundant, you don't have to spend as much money to catch them. And then the last category is stability, minimizing changes in catches from year to year. And again, that's good for market stability and fishery stability to have a more consistent fishery from year to year. So oftentimes in the management objectives, we will include what we call reference points, target and limit reference points. So I talked about the status objectives. That might be what your target reference point is. How abundant do you want your fishery to be? And that might be based not just on the biology of the stock, but different socioeconomic factors, kind of like the catch rates we were talking about. And then your limit reference point is where you don't want to be, that safety objective, the dangerously low point that you want to avoid. Now, For target and limit reference points, you can have biomass-based or B-based reference points and or F-based or fishing mortality-based reference points. You can also look at different types of reference points, but typically we will have biomass and or fishing mortality-based reference points that can be included often in those management objectives. And those management objectives, by setting the vision for the stock and fishery, provide the measures against how we're going to evaluate performance and success of the different harvest strategies that we're testing. We want to find a harvest strategy that will achieve all of our management objectives. This is just another way to show target and limit reference points on a Kobe plot, which many of you are familiar with stock size on the horizontal axis and fishing on the vertical axis. We have our biomass target, which is above our biomass limit, of course. It's the opposite for fishing because the fishing level we want to avoid is, of course, higher than what our target would be. And so we have this green point where the stock is above our target biomass and below our target fishing mortality rate. This is where we want to be. We want to be as close to here as possible. We have this buffer zone in between our target and limit reference point that helps us avoid these red zones where our limit reference points are breached. And this really shows the benefit, one of the benefits of having target reference points to keep us in this, to give this buffer zone to avoid getting to the red danger zones. We also, because management objectives need to be specific and measurable, we should have acceptable levels of risk of breaching the different reference points, for example. And there is some guidance in the UN Fish Stocks Agreement of what those probabilities should be, what the risk level should be. So the UN Fish Stocks Agreement says that the risk of exceeding the limit reference point should be very low, and target reference points should be met on average. These words, very low and on average, these terms are, of course, not too specific. And so then it begs the question, what does very low mean from a quantitative perspective? Our reference points need to have quantities attached to them to be specific and measurable management objectives. So does very low mean less than 5%? Does it mean less than 15%? That is a question. And then what does on average mean? Is it greater than 50%? Is it greater than 60%? Where do we want these acceptable levels of risk to fall out for each fishery? That is something that is agreed as part of a harvest strategy development process. Then there's the harvest control rule, which is the most important part of a harvest strategy, arguably. It is the operational part. This is the same type of Kobe plot that we just saw with the buffer zone. And this blue line here is the harvest control rule. So there's, if you are above, in this very simple, it's called a hockey stick harvest control rule. It's very commonly used in many different kinds of fisheries, although there are limitless forms and variations of harvest control rules. This one is very common. When you're above your biomass target, you fish at your fishing target. If you drop below that, this has a linear decrease in fishing until you get to your biomass limit, at which point you put a very low level of fishing in place for scientific data collection, bycatch, artisanal fisheries, whatever your need might be. But it's quite easy. So if I evaluate the stock and I find out that the population size is right here, I go up vertically. Hopefully you can see my pointer. I go up vertically to the HCR line, and then I go across horizontally, and this tells me exactly how much fishing I can do. So it's very, very straightforward and science-based. There are two different kinds of harvest strategies, harvest control rules, based on the data inputs and how the stock status is calculated. There are empirical harvest control rules or harvest strategies. And this is an example of pollock in the North Pacific, where the input for the monitoring and assessment method is a simple survey, an abundance survey index. There's no processing of that data beyond calculating the survey index. And that's what sets the catch limit in tons. This is a bit, this is a model based. And in this case, there's a simplified stock assessment that processes the collected data and estimates the stock status to then set the fishing level. So we have empirical and model-based harvest strategies. Empirical rules are sometimes viewed as simpler to execute and understand, and so those may be preferable. Model-based, some people feel more comfortable with because it's more similar to a stock assessment. There's a processing of the data, you know, a blending of the data that's maybe more familiar and might be able to handle more complex dynamics in the data or conflicting data. So that might be a reason to do a model based. So like I said, management strategy evaluation is the computer simulation program that's used to develop and test harvest strategies. But some people consider MSE to be the entire process for developing harvest strategies. And I should say here that even in this figure, even though we have these points outlined in a linear fashion, like I said, there's lots of flexibility in these steps. And almost always when you do the testing, you're going to get some feedback from your managers and stakeholders and require revisiting some of your candidate reference points or harvest control rules. And so really it's this whole process together that is the management strategy evaluation. So what is MSE? So I'm just going to give a basic intro here. And I did a word cloud based on an MSE paper to just kind of see the words that are used most frequently. And I think it's quite telling that it's about the whole process, the performance, different candidate harvest strategies that you're testing, stakeholders, looking at statistics, and communication comes out really big as well, which is not very typical for fisheries science. So it just shows that it really is a unique process to develop a fisheries management method. Andre Punt is a professor at the University of Washington and one of the kind of the pioneers in MSE. And this is actually one of his slides. He says that if a management strategy, harvest strategy, does not perform adequately under simulation, we should not expect it to perform and work in the real world. And there are many different things in life that we simulate. We simulate financial markets. We simulate airplanes, whether they're going to successfully fly. And we are not simulating these very often anymore, but certainly, the Hindenburg maybe would not have happened if we did thorough simulations back in the day. So another analogy for how MSE works is to think about designing a race car. So say that we want to design a race car that will perform well and win races on different kinds of tracks, different shapes of tracks, different surfaces, whatever we may be faced with on race day. We want to make sure that our car will do well no matter what the weather is. What if it's raining? What if it's snowing? These are all uncertainties that we have. When we look at designing our race car, we need to think about what kind of tires we want to have and what kind of driver we want to race our car. For example, this type of tire may not do well on a wet track in the rain. Similarly, there's a trade-off between a really fast driver who might crash our car and a slower driver who makes it to the finish line. And so our race team looks at these different variables to see which of the car designs will best meet all of our objectives, balancing trade-offs. Will the car crash? Will it do well despite different types of weather? We want to be able to meet both of the objectives, no crashing and performing well in bad weather. So we decide to pick number 2 is the design that wins. And similarly, with a harvest strategy, we use MSE and test the different performance of, in this case, 3 different harvest strategies against these objectives for stability in the fishery from year to year, maximizing catch, and not overfishing. And so we want to find the harvest strategy that does best. So that's just a little analogy. I talked about how harvest strategies do very well accounting for uncertainty. And that's because the building block of MSE is something called operating models. And these are multiple models that each model reflects a different hypothesis about the state of nature, a different truth for the fishery and the environment. This is an example of the operating model grid for Indian Ocean swordfish. I'm not going to go through the details here, but this is to say that there are 7 different main uncertainties that were identified for this stock. So the 7 rows are the 7 main uncertainties. And each of those uncertainties has up to 3 different options of what could be true, what could be real. And so we take this grid and we do all of the combinations of the different options in this grid, which is, back to high school math, 3 times 2 times 3 times 3 times 2 times 3 times 2 for all of the combinations. And we end up with 648 operating models. This is very different from a stock assessment that might have one base case stock assessment model with some sensitivity runs. In MSE, we're looking for a harvest strategy that will perform well against all 648 of these operating models. There's also a process in MSE called conditioning that you'll hear talked about. And we condition the operating models by fitting the real world data to the operating models to eliminate any scenarios that are implausible. And that allows us to develop what is called our reference set of operating models, our most likely scenarios. There are also a robustness set of operating models that are possible, but less likely scenarios. Perhaps in a robustness operating model, for example, we would consider an extreme climate change scenario where the water temperature increased 5 degrees Celsius or something like that. That could be, possible, but less likely. And that would be a robustness test that we would look to see the performance, but we wouldn't consider it as carefully and as seriously as we would consider our reference set. And that is developed through conditioning. I know Dr. Chang is going to be going into this later, so I won't talk too much about this, but just to say that MSE uses this closed loop, again, looking at the uncertainties in the fishery to evaluate harvest strategy performance. So we start with our operating model that we just discussed to generate simulated fishery data. We put that into the observation error model, which adds plausible levels of imprecision and bias because the fishery data we collect is never exactly correct, right? There's always some under or over reporting. We then put that into our harvest strategy to estimate our stock status and apply the HCR to set, for example, a total allowable catch. We then put that into the implementation error model, which says whether we implement the management perfectly or maybe we catch a little bit extra because there's some illegal fishing in the fishery, or we undercatch because of domestic regulations that don't allow the full quota to be caught, something like that. And then the output of that implementation error model, the tonnage of fish that's caught, is put back into the operating model. And this cycle is one management period. So for example, you might have a 3-year management cycle. And so this loop would be representative of a 3-year period in your model. And you would continue to go around this loop for many years into the future, for example, 30 years into the future, to estimate the long-term performance of your harvest strategy. And you then want to compare that long-term performance to your management objectives that you set at the beginning of the process. A couple other benefits of harvest strategies and MSE, because they are so good at accounting for uncertainty, is that they are very good at evaluating climate change scenarios and also helping to implement the ecosystem-based fisheries management, or the ecosystem approach to fishery management. And this figure here shows how an MSE harvest strategy can be developed using MSE that takes ecosystem factors into account. You might, for example, when you're setting management objectives, set ecosystem objectives such as a bycatch cap. I'm fishing for tuna and I only want to take this tonnage of sea turtles as bycatch, for example. You can set reference points such as a water temperature that you want to watch out for, determine acceptable levels of risk. Maybe you want lower risk tolerance for, say, a herring, which is a very important prey species. You can include climate change driven uncertainties when you're defining your operating models. And then maybe you would do multi-species HCRs for stocks that are caught in the same fishery and in multi-stock fisheries. So these are different ways you can factor in ecosystem considerations to your harvest strategy, and you might even adopt a harvest strategy that is multi-species for target and bycatch species. And for tunas, we see that being done for tropical tunas because big eye, yellowfin, and skipjack are often caught together in the same fisheries. I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip over some of this, but for tuning, you will hear that term used. This is a way to choose a common performance standard that all fisheries, all harvest strategies must meet. For example, a 60% probability of being in that Kobe green zone where you want to be. So you set that as your tuning objective. And then once all of your harvest strategies meet that objective, you can compare the performance against the other objectives. For example, choosing the one that once it meets this 60% probability, you would pick the one, for example, that might maximize catch after that. So the final step is, of course, adoption of the harvest strategy. That will be based on your MSE results and your input from your scientists and managers, input that is often in international forums accepted and solicited through a dialogue group, a formal working group to develop management harvest strategies. So in this case, sorry, was that for me? No? Okay. So looking at these results, this is catch here on the horizontal axis and population size on the vertical axis. This is your target for biomass. And so we want to be above our target for biomass while maximizing catch. And so in this case, for example, we would choose this harvest strategy. And so this is the type of MSE result that one will review when selecting a harvest strategy. Like I said, dialogue groups are an important part of this process. Stakeholder engagement being a hallmark of the harvest strategy approach. Communication is really key. And so to have a dedicated forum for that interaction is important. So once your harvest strategy is adopted, there is a feedback loop that makes harvest strategies a form of adaptive management. So you'll start with monitoring your fishery. You'll start with monitoring your fishery. You'll use those monitoring data to assess your fishery. You will then compare your stock status that you have assessed to your objectives. And then based on where you are relative to your objectives, you might implement a management change, or perhaps you'll keep your management the same. And so this feedback loop goes around and around each management cycle, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and you go through this adaptive management feedback loop. There are also exceptional circumstances that are set in harvest strategies. An exceptional circumstance is a rare or unforeseen event that perhaps was not tested within the MSE that you did, or maybe one of your key data inputs is missing. And so that would be an exceptional circumstance. And not only do you include those exceptional circumstances in your harvest strategy, but you also agree to a process for what you do should you determine that an exceptional circumstance exists. So that's called an exceptional circumstances protocol. You have an exceptional circumstance. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to skip over this climate slide in the interest of time. It just shows how harvest strategies can be used to make fisheries management more climate smart, climate ready. But we'll get into where we are with development of harvest strategies, starting with tunas. These are the harvest strategies that are in place currently at the 5 tuna RFMOs. So you see there are quite a number of them. But if you look at the number of harvest strategies in development, it's an even greater number. And these highlighted in red are scheduled to be adopted, have the MSEs completed, and the harvest strategies adopted this year in 2024. So there are big opportunities coming up at the tuna RFMOs. And just to note that, you know, not only are we seeing harvest strategies adopted for tuna, but we see swordfish, mahi, and there's even some preliminary work being done on blue sharks. Harvest strategies are also being developed at the non-tuna RFMOs. There was a harvest control rule, a preliminary one adopted for SARI at NPFC this year. The yellow stars indicate the non-tuna RFMOs that are currently already developing harvest strategies, and CEOFA gets a blue star because they are moving in that direction and developing a process for how to develop MSEs for their important stocks. Looking at harvest strategies around the world, some of the species, this is not a comprehensive list. There are many others that aren't reflected here, but this is just to show that harvest strategies are being developed for predators and prey, pelagic species and bottom fish, vertebrates, invertebrates, international and domestic fisheries. I want to close today by sharing some of the work that we're doing. Like I said, communication is key for harvest strategies development. We have this website, harveststrategies.org, and there is this press tab is now resources, and under that resources tab, we have a blog, we have an interactive with this case studies here that you can click and learn about different harvest strategies in place or in development around the world. And for resources, we have many different languages of material available. I just screenshotted some of our available materials in the Asian languages here, but we have many more. And if there's a product you see that you want in your language, please just reach out to me and we can try to get it translated and produced for you. If there's a topic that you think that needs to be discussed and there are questions about, also please let us know and we will try to develop a communications material product on that issue. We also have interviews and animations about the different harvest strategy related content. that include subtitles in the East Asian languages. So again, you know, please let us know if there's anything that you think would be beneficial to have in addition. I would also like to mention that we are doing a 4-year project with the FAO to develop more and more communications materials for harvest strategies. And as part of that, we have a quarterly webinar series on harvest strategies topics. And our next one is in October, and I hope you all can join us. So just final considerations to close. When we talk about stakeholder engagement, we mean commercial interests, both fishers and markets. And I'm thrilled to see that we have some market representatives on this webinar today, recreational fishers and environmental interests as well. So the definition of stakeholder is broad. At the same time, fishery managers control both the front end at setting management objectives and the back end at adopting the harvest strategy. It's important to be very transparent in the process, the timeline for development, and the process of development and the purpose, why we're doing it for a specific fishery. Just another reminder that there is flexibility. There are multiple paths forward in the type of harvest strategy and the order of development steps. It's also important to note that you can do harvest strategies for a single stock, or you might do your harvest strategy based on the fishery. And this schematic here is how the tuna fisheries are being looked at for harvest strategies in the Western and Central Pacific. Instead of having a skipjack harvest strategy that only manages skipjack, for example, the skipjack harvest strategy is actually a harvest strategy that manages the purse seine fishery, the archipelagic waters, and the pole and line fishery. And because of that, the skipjack harvest strategy actually manages skipjack, yellowfin, and big eye, because all of those fish species are caught in those fisheries. So just again, another way that this can be, you know, there's flexibility in the approaches. And then, you know, a note that because we've been developing these for some time, there are tools that can make the harvest strategy development process more efficient. There is an upfront investment required for MSE, for example, but there are now MSE packs easier. There are roadmaps that show how MSE can be developed and harvest strategies can be implemented. We can learn from each other and learn from the different processes to make each subsequent process more efficient and more successful as well. Lessons learned. And then again, just to highlight the importance of communication, both on the science side and the management side, to keep the process inclusive and transparent and have everyone understand what the process is, what the goal is, and where we are headed. When I say have everyone understand, it doesn't mean everyone needs to understand the intricacies of the MSE. That we leave to the scientists, but we need to have everyone understand the general approach and goal. And just this is my final slide showing our social media links and web pages, and we work very closely integrated with the the Pew team, and so I included their harvest strategies website here as well. And I just want to end by thanking you all for bearing with me through this very long presentation. And thank you to Gunther for inviting me to be here today. And I will be happy to take questions at the end after the other speakers when we have our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shayna, for your enlightening discussion on harvest strategies. I'm sure for most of you, you've never heard the word harvest strategy said so much in 50 minutes. But I hope that after hearing all of it, you have a better understanding of what harvest strategies is and how it can be so beneficial for fisheries management. Next on our schedule is actually a 10-minute break. I understand that was 50 minutes of very intense conversation on a new topic for many people in here. So I want to give everyone 10 minutes to stretch your legs, go to the bathroom and everything else. Come back and we will have our next speaker, Dr. Jiang of Taiwan, to speak more on harvest strategies from a scientist's perspective. Then after that, we will have Aiko Yamauchi from Seafood Legacy to discuss harvest strategies further from the Japanese context as well. So I hope that everyone will come back in 10 minutes and we will start again. So thank you so much. Hello, everybody. We are 2 minutes early for our break, but I want to give Dr. Zhang some time to set up. Dr. Zhang, if you are here, can you please share your screen?
Okay.
Fantastic. So just so everyone is aware, this presentation will be done in Chinese. So please stick to your language below, continue speaking using the interpreter below. So yes, please, Dr. Zhang.
Okay. Thank you. So it's hard. I need to speak in Chinese. Yeah. So I have to change my mind. OK. 谢谢这个各位这个观众好来参加这个workshop。那也谢谢 Pew 的邀请啊。那我今天要跟大家介绍的是这个渔捞策略管理渔业的好处啊，从我们科学家的角度来看那因为harvest strategy 这个对一般的管理者或者是业者是一个相当复杂的一个概念，所以我才选择用中文来说明这样子对我们这个有一些这个中文讲中文的会比较容易懂好，那首先我要先说明就是我们传统的资源评估是怎么做的传统的资源评估，我们会去收集一些生物的资料，生物特性的资料，然后会收集它的渔获量，然后我们也会建立一个资源指标。我们把这些的数据放到一个我们的资源评估的模式，叫做 population dynamic model 有很多种的 model。然后之后我们就会估出来现在的资源状况是怎么样，它是不是已经有被过渔，或者是正在过渔中。那除了这个之外，我们也会提出一些的管理的建议，比如说努力量是不是要限制渔获量是不是要减少之类的。然后我们会说如果减少多少的渔获量配额减少多少，然后未来的资源会怎么变动这样那这个科学的建议提出来之后就会给那个管理者，那管理者就要讨论到底最后要采取什么样的管理措施。但是这个照往常的经验，就是常常都要讨论很久因为这个会牵扯到各个国家的利益，然后也对于未来不是那么样的确定，所以都会讨论很久。那所以就很不容易达到共识。那这个对业者对管理者都是一个蛮痛苦的经验，因为我们没有办法确定资源状况是不是真的这个样子。那我们配额的定也不是很透明，然后这样的沟通需要很长的时间，我们也不知道这个现在所定的这个管理措施是不是真的能够达到这个我们的目标。那所以就会有这个 harvest strategy 这个概念出来。好，那它发展 harvest strategy 这个渔捞策略来管理渔业有许多的优点那我稍微归纳一下，我大概就提出我认为比较重要的这个4个点一个就是刚刚那个 Dr. Miller 有提到这个现实世界有许多的不确定性，那这个 model不是这个harvest strategy 可以把这些的不确定性都考虑在内。然后我们的管理目标除了这个保育生态保育这些的生物资源之外，我们还有可以考虑其他的管理目标。那 harvest strategy 就可以平衡各个的管理目标。那第3个就是我们是大家讨论经过一些的 dialogue 就是这个科学家管理者的这些的对谈之后同意的一个规则，所以它就是可以预测的，它是透明的，而且它是能够达到我们的永续目标的那我们可以提出很多的 harvest strategy 可以提出很多的这个渔捞策略。那这些的策略我们可以透过 这个 MSE 这个Management Strategy Evaluation 好，这个 MSE 来做测试，然后找出一个最能够达到我们所设定的目标的这个渔捞策略。好，
不好意思，张老师，
是
一个一个慢慢说吗？
讲慢一点是吗？
是，
哦，sorry，
没事。
嗯，好，excuse me。好，那我就一项一项的跟大家介绍啊。因为我原来说是要限定15分钟，所以我讲的有点比较快一点，我现在稍微慢一点哈。好，那首先我们就是不确定性的问题啊。excuse me。好，那渔业是一种很特殊的经济活动。在这个sorry，渔业是一个很特殊的经济活动啊。那我们的渔业资源本身就有一些自然的因素造成很多的不确定性啊。比如说这张表上面有列的，它有自然死亡啊，它有捕充量的改变啊，这个清鱼量跟捕充量的关系也会常常会有产生一些不确定性。那另外渔业经营者还有这个经营的这个结构。也有可能会产生很多的不确定性啊，这个我们叫做人为因素产生的不确定性啊。那我们就是这个世界有太多的不确定性，就影响到我们的管理的成效，所以我们就需要把这个不确定性考虑在我们的这个管理的里面啊。所以这样 harvest strategy 这个渔捞策略就可以考虑到这些的不确定性。那科学家把这个不确定性稍微做一点分类啊。首先一个不确定性叫做随机或过程的不确定性，也就是说不管有没有在管理，这些的不确定性都会存在的啊。比如说这张图，这张是太平洋黑尾的这个补充量的曲线，这个是我们没有办法控制的，它就是会这样的变动啊。这个我们对它的理解没有办法啊，就是我们没办法完全掌握它的变动，那这个叫做随机或过程的不确定性啊。那另外一种就是我们在做资源研究，我们要了解这个资源状况，我们需要有资料，有一些观测的资料，然后这些的资料我们需要去估计这个生物的一些的参数。那这些观测有可能也会有一些的不确定性，比如说我们的样本数不够，或者是我们测量的方法不太对啊。那我们估计的参数也有可能会产生一些的不确定性啊。那举个例子，就这个是中西太平洋大目尾的成长方程式。那早期我们是根据上面这一条2014年的成长方程式，那做出来的资源评估的结果是说，大部尾的资源状况很不好，所以我们需要马上采取一些的管理措施。结果过了几年，我们发现这个成长式不太对，然后我们就重新估了一个成长式，结果用了这个成长式之后，发现大目尾的资源非常健康。所以这个就是一种不确定性。那这个不确定性就需要考虑在我们的管理的项目里面哈。那另外一个不确定性是叫估计或者是模型的不确定性。我们这些的资源的状况是透过刚刚说的一些的资料，然后我们用一些的 model 去估计它。那我们可能估计的方法有产生一些的不确定性。我们也有可能我们的 model 不是那么能够反映真实的状况，那这个就会产生一个不确定性啊。像这张图显示的就是有一个鱼种，在某一年估计的时候它的是后面就觉得它的资源是越来越好这个恢复的非常快，然后越估计到后面几年才发现不对，这个资源并没有想象的变得这么好。那这个就是估计上面产生的不确定性啊。好，那我们定出来管理规则、管理措施，那这些管理措施是不是能够真正的被执行，它也有不确定性 好，那这些比如说刚刚这个Dr. Mina 也有提到一些这个没有 record 的那些的渔获量，像这些的它就会产生我们执行上面的不确定性啊。所以我们你看看这个现实的这个世界里面，谈到这个资源，它其实有很多种的不确定在影响它。那这个不确定是因为我们对他们的知识没有办法完整啊，我们对于这些项目的过去、现在、未来的过程，我们这些的知识不够完整。那知识不足就会带来风险，就会带来风险。那风险我们可以从2个角度来看，那一个就是发生负面结果的可能性，这个就是它可能会这个资源会崩溃的这个可能性有多高。那另外一面从正面的来看，那就是我们可以达到成功的几率有多高，达到我们的这个TRP， 就是我们的Target Reference Point， 我们的目标参考点的几率有多高，我们可以从这个2个角度来看啊。那 Harvest Strategy 里面有一个叫做 Risk Level 就是那个可接受的一个风险水平。那这个风险水平就是来反映那个负面结果的可能性有多高我们可以接受多高。刚刚也有提到说这个very low 我们希望非常低，但是多低那就是这个科学家跟管理者要去对话要来接受一个可以接受的一个风险水平。那这个水平它可以平衡我们生态的需求，也可以平衡这个管理者或者是业者这方面的经济上面的需求。我们可以不用定到非常非常低那我们可以定到一个是大家可以接受的一个风险水平那通常这个 Pew 的那个文献里面有提到，就通常当不确定性比较高的时候，管理者就会把这个风险的容忍度，就是那个 risk level 把它设的比较低一点。好，那这张图是要给大家看一个概念，就是我们早期的都用单一个资源评估的模式来估计这个过去跟现在的资源状况就是前半段这条线。然后呢，我们用同样的一个模式，我们来估计预测未来的资源量的变动是怎么样这是后面这一段。那这个就没有反映到现实这个世界的不确定性那所以慢慢的，大家这个对于这个渔业这个现实的状况的不确定性越来越多了解，我们就可以在我们的模式里面在我们的这个参数里面就可以把它考虑进来比如我们可以有更多的模式去做估计。那比如刚刚有提到我们的那个 operational model 我们的那个操作模式，我们可以有多种的操作模式然后我们对于未来这个补充量，我们也可以设定很多种的这个不同的情境，那这些都可以把它包括进来。那这样子我们就在我们的估计里面就可以把这个比较模拟到现实世界的可能资源的变动会是怎么样那就不会有这个像早期这种产生比较大的误差好，那我举个例子，这个是南方黑尾委员会他们做的早期做的一个harvest strategy 它的看右边的这个它就是在2005年的时候他们设计的一个，就如果2006年我们的这个南方黑尾的渔获量马上减低5000吨，会是怎么状况？那它的结论就是，你如果减低5000吨，那你会有50%的几率，50%的几率，这个资源不会比2004年，就是他在做这个资源评估的前一年的状况还要惨那就是这些的黑色的点，黑色的这些线，就是代表它的是 median 中位值，也就是50%，也就是说，如果减少5000吨，它这个有50%的几率，它不会低于2004年的水准，而且未来会越来越好，会越来越好这个就是给管理者一个 可以预期，如果我接受这样子的管理措施，我预期我未来会是怎么样啊？这个就是一种的 harvest strategy 啊。那所以我们刚刚提的这个 harvest strategy， 我们可以设计很多种，然后我们在里面这个透过这个 operational model， 就是这个作业模式或者是操作模式，我们来模拟真实世界的状况啊，所有的不确定性我们都可以考虑在这个operating model 里面啊。那在这里的操作模式里面，我们可以考虑这个自然死亡率在不同的状况啊，然后你甚至气候变迁也可以考虑进去，这个你的 steepness 补充量的这些的production， 它的这个参数你也可以考虑不同的参数在里面。好，那你等于说科学家做了一部机器，这部机器是可以模拟这个大部分的不确定性的状况。好，然后呢，我们再去设计不同的这个 harvest strategy。这个 harvest strategy 在这里就相当于这个 MP 叫 management procedures 啊。那你可以设计不同的 MP 不同的 HS， 这个不同的 HS 拿到这台机器上面去测试，看看它符不符合我们的目标。你可以想象很多种的很多种的 MP， 然后你最后就把它拿到这台机器去测试。这台机器它已经包括了这个现实社会大部分的不确定性，然后测试出来，找出一个是最符合我们需求的最符合我们的需求，那个就当做我们的 harvest 的 strategy， 将来要去实施的那它这个本身是有一个循环那个因为大家不是科学家，我就不太介绍这个里面的循环，但里面有一个核心的要件，就是这个决策规则的 decision rule， 或者是刚刚说的这个 harvest control rule 这个渔获管控的规则，这个我们等一下再说明那所以我们现在就等于说，我们用这种方式，我们可以把这个现实社会的这个现实世界的这些不确定性，我们都把它含在我们的里面，然后我们再来讨论说，我们要哪一个可以最适合、最能够达到我们的管理目标那你最后的决定的一个，你大概也就会有这两个项目，一个就是你超过限制参考点的可接受风险是多少那通常大概是20%在尾鱼上面。那另外一个就是你希望达到目标参考点的几率有多少要有多高那像黑尾就是60% 的几率。那像刚刚看到的南方黑尾，它是70% 的几率。那这些的数字这些的几率就是由管理者跟科学家来对谈刚刚那个Dr. Miller 一直强调的 communication， 就是这个对谈到最后大家可以接受的一个数字那这个就会变成我们之后就照着我们决定的 harvest strategy 来执行我们的渔业的管理那这样子这个就可以把很多的不确定性把它含在里面好，那第二个我觉得它很棒的地方就是 harvest 这个渔捞策略可以平衡不同的管理的目标。那这个是Dr. Waters， 他是一个很有名的这个资源评估的学者他就说这个很多渔业管理会失败，就是因为他没有考虑到这个政治或经济的一些的限制那我们在建立这个渔捞策略的时候，确定管理目标是很重要的第一步那早期我们只关心这个资源能不能健康。但是如果我们希望它能够永续，我们就还要考虑到社会经济的目标。那这个我们可以说它是利润的问题，就是我们希望渔获量能够最高，或者是我们的渔获效率这个CPV 渔获率可以最高，那就代表我们的利润会是最高的。那我们也可以考虑到产业的稳定性我们不希望如果配额要调整，我们不希望这个每一次调整的太大这样子那个产业就会受到冲击，所以我们也可以把产业稳定性摆在我们的管理目标里面 那管理目标可以有很多啊，像之前也有人谈过，我希望我的就业率最高啊等等，你都可以谈。那只要它能够用某一些的指标来量化，好，也就是原则上我们所定的管理目标是要有意义的，好，要明确的，要能够量化的，好，而且是大家可以接受的。那个 harvest strategy 这个渔捞策略就可以从大家定的目标中取得一个平衡。好，我们在 MSE 里面就会去测试各种的这个渔捞策略哪一种可以达到我们的目标。当然没有办法全部目标都达到，所以这个就需要对话，在这个借由这个对话中决定一个最合适的大家最可以接受的一个渔捞策略啊，那这样子我们就可以有了很好的方向，我们的管理就可以就比较有具体的结果哈。那管理目标的类别好，跟刚刚也有介绍过，我稍微就说明，就大概通常会有这几项，就是我们希望资源健康的几率最大，像刚刚我们说60%，也有人要70%，好，你也可以某些鱼种你可以稍微这个高一点，然后这个80或怎么样都可以好。然后我们希望资源低于我们的限制参考点的几率要最小，好，20%、5%、10%啊，这个就看我们的渔业的对象跟大家可以接受的。那我们会希望渔获量最大，这个也可以是一个管理目标。我们希望渔业的利润最大啊，然后我们也希望各个年间渔获量的变动最小啊，这个是5个比较常见的这个管理目标。我们也可以希望那个什么混货的鱼种啊，要混货量啊越少最少。这个也可以加上去哈，只要就符合这些的原则都可以，然后这个渔捞策略就可以从这里面取得一个平衡。好，第3个我觉得也不错的就是我们可以预先这个建立一个大家预先同意的一个永续的规则啊。那因为刚刚说的这些的都需要对话，都需要科学家、管理者这个很多次的对话。那这个对话也就是大家共同参与的。那这个就有助于我们就可以提高这个管理策略的接受度，还有遵从性，好，大家就愿意遵从它，好，那因为大家一起讨论的，所以这个决策就很透明，好，就不会有让人家觉得是某些这个这某些团体的特别的这个特别的影响，好，那因为也是大家所沟通的最后的结果，虽然沟通的过程会有一些冲突，但是最后定出来之后，我们就可以降低这个后续的沟通上面的冲突，那也就会降低这个协商所需要的时间和不确定性，那因此也就可以提高管理的效率啊。这个是我们在WCPFC 的中期太平洋委员会有一年我们开会为了一个鱼种。我们就讨论这个到底要怎么做管理，讨论到开会的那个会期的最后一天的晚上的半夜，我记得是12点还是1点才结束，然后大家才赶着要搭飞机回国啊。你就看要讨论一个管理的决定，需要花很多的时间，很多的冲突。那如果我们能够把这个渔捞策略是预先的定下来啊，那这个就可以避免像这一些的冲突，就可以提高这个管理的效率哈。那除了之外也因为它是我们在做决定这个渔捞策略的时候有定一些的管理目标，这个管理目标一定会包括一个保障生态的安全啊，保障这个资源不会低于我们的限制参考点啊。那我们也会可能也会有一个限制渔获量的变动啊，不希望它每一年的变动太大啊，所以它就可以降低风险，它也可以提高这个渔业经营的稳定性啊。那它更是可以预期，大家都可以知道，如果现在科学的资源评估结果是怎么样啊，那我们就可以预期我们会采取什么样的措施哈，大家都可以有在规划它，尤其业者在规划它的产业经营模式的时候就可以比较有一点方向。好， 那这个里面讲到这个非常重要的那个核心哈，刚刚也有特别在做一些的解释哈，我这里也再稍微说明，我拿这个例子来说明，这个是那个 Gerard Dinado 他提出来的一个这个说明，我拿他的图片啊，这个是蛮好的一个例子哈，这个就是当水资源充足，我们底下的是那个水资源的量。那右边这个是我们要采取的行动，好，那当水资源很充足的时候，那我们就不需要很充足，那就会这条线，那我们就不需要采取任何的行动。可是当水资源慢慢的减少，慢慢的状况不好的时候，我们就要采取一些的行动，像2年前，好，这个台湾就是都不下雨，产生这个旱灾，那就水资源就缺乏，那所以这个如果我们已经先有预先同意了这个叫做 harvest control rules， 好，这个管控的规则，那我们看到这个水资源，比如说这个水资源到了这边了。那我们相对的，我们的决定就是不准洗车不准拿这个水来洗车，或者就是你不可以去游泳这游泳池就都不准开对吧？那水资源更糟糕的时候，我们可能就要更严格的管理。好，那这个就是我们这个渔捞策略里面的一个核心就是这个叫做渔获管控规则 （Harvest Control Rule） 那这个是需要大家预先同意。同意之后，那我们就可以增加我们管理的效率还有透明度。好，那也可以避免昂贵又困难这政治的协商那刚刚说的这个
老师，不好意思，我是 Lisa， 不好意思，因为我们时间有点超过，所以要麻烦老师帮我们接下来的简报稍微选重点讲。对，因为我们还有另外一位讲者，谢谢老师，不好意思哦。
不好意思，好
谢谢。
好，这因为又要讲慢又要好，那我就有些就不详细的讲那这个HC 它可以有各种的形式这个看你是要当这个资源不好，你要慢慢的管理，还是要很快速的管理这个就可以透过这个对话来决定那最后一个就是我觉得是它可以透过这个调试的管理来做测试那这个调试这个适应性的环境管理这个我就不多做解释，大概的概念就是我们是边做边学，边做边调整那传统的管理方式是我们实施几年之后再做资源评估，然后发现这个措施效果不好的时候这样就已经过了几年了那这个例子我就不讲那渔捞策略就有一个很好的特点，就是它有一个反馈的回路那这个回路可以在电脑里面去运转、去测试就是你在电脑里面测试可以的，我们才来拿到真实的世界里面才来用那这样子我们就可以节省它的时间这个应用的时间那也就是我们这些想到的一些的这个渔捞策略，我们都可以用整个这个 MSE 来做测试，找到一个最符合我们需求的、最符合管理目标的这个就不会产生这个管理措施一实施的时候，结果发现就没有办法达到目标的这种问题那像这个就是你可以有很多的管理目标去做测试你可以选择，比如说我希望渔获量要最大的你就可以知道这每一条都是代表一个这个渔捞策略你就可以看到哪一个是我要的那如果渔获量的稳定性哪一个是我要的你就可以从这里面做一些的测试那最后2张投影片那这个是南方黑尾在2011年定的一个管理渔捞策略那它的目标就很简单的2个，一个就是资源量要有70%的几率可以在2035年这个重建到未有渔业状况的20%那这个边就有一个重建的几率然后他希望每3年可以这个可捕量的变动不要超过3000吨，那就是希望它的这个渔获量的变动是稳定的。那他就会测试了很多个 这个渔捞策略啊，最后决定了这个渔捞策略是怎么样，然后也结果这个资源也照着这个渔捞策略的预期啊就恢复了啊。好，那所以我看起来渔捞策略大家一听就是会有点害怕，是因为它有点复杂啊。那但是如果它就像一个现代的渔船，那如果我们一旦这个了解跟熟悉之后，就可以带来前所未有的效率跟永续性啊。它不仅可以考虑到海洋的不确定性，还能够在多个目标之间取得一个平衡啊，然后并提供一个清楚的导航的规则。所以虽然这个渔捞策略这个管理者跟甚至科学家都有点害怕，这个学习的曲线虽然很陡很难，不太容易，但是只要掌握了这艘船，我们的渔业就可以更有韧性，能够朝向永续渔业的发展。好，我的报告就到这边，很抱歉这个时间拖长了一点。好，谢谢。
Zhang Laoshi, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that was very informative for a lot of people here. I hope for the Taiwanese participants, if you would like his presentation, as long as it's fine with you, Doctor, we may be able to share it with some of our participants. There's a lot of information there, and I think it might be useful for people to mull over it a bit more and read it in more detail. There's a lot of graphs and a lot of very important information within these slides. I think we're all very lucky to have heard that in this amount of time. Next, I would like to welcome Aiko Yamauchi from Seafood Legacy to speak. Professor, if you could stop sharing your screen so that Aiko can share hers. Professor Zhang. Thank you. Aiko-san, please. Aiko, we cannot hear you currently. Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gunther. 本日はこのような機会をいただきまして誠にありがとうございます。シーフードレガシーの山内と申します。本日私からは、日本における漁獲戦略策定の現状と課題というお話を、共有させていただきたいと思います。これまで私自身の漁獲戦略、またはハーベストストラテジーとの関わりなんですけれども、2008年から2019年まで、マグロ類を中心に、先ほどシャナさん、それから、チャン先生からもありましたけれども、RFMO での漁獲戦略策定に関連する、アドボカシーワークを、環境 NGO として、行っておりました。またですね、日本の国内で、または関連するアジア圏でですね、MSC 漁業認証の取得の支援というのを行ってきております。さらに2017年から2023年までは、水産庁の水産政策審議会の資源管理分科会というところで特別委員をさせていただいておりました。こうした経験の中で、漁獲戦略というものを学び、実際にどういうふうに日本では、インプリメントされているのかというところを見てまいりましたので、本日はその話をしたいと思います。一つ、日本で今歴史的な議論が起きている背景の一つにはですね、RFMO への参画をしたことで、日本の中で漁獲戦略を検討したり、そういったものを取り入れていく、そういうキャパシティビルディングといいますか、成熟をしてきたということは強調すべきかと思っております。何度も出てきておりますけれども、CCSBT における南マグロの管理方式の導入であったり、ICAT における大西洋クロマグロの資源回復計画の策定や、太平洋クロマグロの資源回復の策定、 また WCPFC の北小委員会におけるビンナガの漁獲戦略の策定であったり、NPFC でのサンマサバの漁獲戦略に関連する議論というのを通じて、国内での資源管理の在り方にこうした動きが大きく影響してきて、どういう形で日本の中で資源管理をしていくべきなのかというところの大きな改革が起きたというふうに理解しております。実際に日本の資源管理を行う上で、また漁業を管理する上でのベースになっているのが漁業法というものです。この漁業法は1949年に策定をされて、漁業の生産に関する基本的な制度を定めて、漁業者および漁業従事者を主体とする漁業調整機構の運営によって水面を総合的に利用する。これで漁業の生産力を発展させて、漁業の民主化を図るということを目的に定められてきました。でこの漁業法というのは、実に70年間にわたってですね、大きな改正はなく、いくつかの小さな改正をしながら、現代まで使われてきたものになります。が、2010年代に入りまして、いよいよ日本の資源状況は長期的な減少傾向にあったということ。また日本の食卓にとって重要な水産資源をしっかり回復して持続可能な状態で未来へつなぐ必要性というのが出てきたところで、2018年に大きな改革が70年ぶりに漁業法においてされることになりました。この漁業法の中で、大きく変化した一つ、いくつかのポイントとしては、資源管理のお話が今日ですので、一番だけを説明させていただきますと、資源管理においては、資源の維持や増大をして、より安定した漁業の経営を目指すと。また国際交渉を通じて周辺水域の資源も維持、増大させるということを目的とした改正が行われました。この他にも養殖であったり沿岸漁業、遠洋や沖合漁業、または水産物の流通加工についても、改めて見直されて、現在の漁業法に改正をされています。この法改正に伴って、水産庁では資源管理に関する基本的な考え方についても改めて、近代的な文言で修正をしております。で資源管理は、水産資源ごとに最新の科学的知見を踏まえて実施された資源評価に基づいて資源管理の目標を設定し、当該資源管理の目標の達成を目指し、タック総漁獲可能量による、管理を行い、最大持続生産量 MSY を実現できる資源量の水準というのを維持する。または MSYを実現できる資源量まで回復させるということを基本的な考え方として明文化しています。では、この2018年に行われた漁業法の改正、それから新しい資源管理の基本的な考え方というものを漁獲戦略という切り口で見たときにどういうふうに見えるのかという部分を少しまとめさせていただきました。MSC のウェブサイトからハーベストストラテジーというものがそもそもどういう要素が必要なのかということをここに抜き出させていただいておりますけれども、すでにシャナさんであったり、チャン先生の方から、ハーベストストラテジー漁獲戦略というのはこういうものですというご説明があったので、ここは割愛させていただきます。でこうしたものに合わせたときに、日本では2018年以降ですね、目標管理基準値、ターゲットリファレンスポイントとして MSY を、限界管理基準値、リミットレファレンスポイントとして B リミットを提示するということを、法律の中で明言しています。今までは何を目標に管理をするのかというのが曖昧に、漁業の管理、資源の管理が行われてきたという歴史が日本ではあったんですけれども、いよいよ何を目標にするのか、それを科学的な知見に基づいて、または客観的な指標でもって示したということになります。また、漁獲コントロールルールを実際に採用していくにあたって、そのツールとして 科学的知見をベースとした総漁獲可能量、トータルライアブルキャッチを設定する管理へ移行するということを目標にしています。実際には、目標として日本の全生産量、海面での、漁業による生産量の 80% がこの、総漁獲可能量、タックによる、管理に移行するということになっております。また、大臣許可漁業という、大規模な漁業の形態については、総漁獲可能量、タックを設定するだけではなくて、インディビジュアルクォータ、IQ を導入していくということを、新たに、明言しています。で、この中で非常に重要なポイントとなる資源評価なんですけれども、実際にこの2018年の改革以降ですね、それまで県が主体となって実施していた水産資源のうち、資源評価対象に含まれなかった17種を加えて、まずは資源評価の対象種を67種に拡大すること。さらに最終的にはですね、条件に合う水産資源の中から全体で80種程度を選定、調査を開始することで、資源評価のスコープというのを200種にまで拡大をしています。でこうしたことで、資源評価体制そのものの充実というのが図られるとともに、それに伴うモニタリングの体制というのも改善されることになりました。具体的には、これまで漁協であったり、漁業者から収集をしていたデータというのを、ICT という技術を用いて、いち早くタイムリーなマナーでそれを収集して資源評価に反映させていくという仕組みを整えるということが行われています。実際に管理目標、それぞれの魚種について管理目標を、達成するために、どういうふうに進めるのかという、流れが、フローチャートがこちらになります。まずは資源の調査を行って、そこから、行政機関からは独立して、研究機関が資源評価を行うと。その資源評価の結果と、資源管理目標などの、検討材料ですね。というのを、サイエンティスト、研究者から受け取って、行政機関が関係者に説明するというステップを踏みます。でこの関係者への説明では、MSY を達成する資源の水準の値、これが目標管理基準値、ターゲットレファレンスポイントになるわけですけれども、これともう一つリミットレファレンスポイント、限界管理基準値を設定する、魚種ごとに設定する。その他、実際に枯渇であったり乱獲が起きているような魚種については、回復目標、リカバリーターゲットを定めるというようなステップになってきます。で、目標管理基準値が決まったところで、実際にいくつかの漁獲シナリオ、ハーベストシナリオを関係者に示した上で、実際にどういうシナリオを取って、どういう漁獲ルールに落とし込んでいくのかということが決まっていきます。もちろんそこが決まった管理措置が決まった後も、データを収集することによって、さらに資源調査を充実させ、資源評価を充実させという形で、このフローがぐるぐると回っていくというのが想定されている仕組みになります。で、これまでもステークホルダーの参画、シャナさんからも、チャン先生からも、非常にステークホルダーの参画というのが、ハーベストストラテジーを策定する上では大事になってくるというお話がありましたけれども、日本の事例として一つブリを、取り上げて、どういうふうに、では日本の中ではハーベストストラテジーを策定するにあたって、ステークホルダーの参画を図っているのかというお話をさせていただきたいと思います。まず魚種ごとにですので、この場合にはブリですね、イエローテールになりますけれども、ブリの科学的な情報というのをまとめた上で、分かりやすくまとめた上で、関係者に、ステークホルダーに示すということをしていきます。 例えば、ここの左側の箱ですね。こちらは、ブリについて、どういうターゲットレファレンスポイントになるのか、リミットレファレンスポイントになるのか、それは、MSY であるとか、B リミットという、分かりにくいサイエンティフィックな単語ではなくて、実際に、漁業者にとってはそれは何万トンの魚に換算されるのかという数字を出します。漁業者にとっては MSY レベルということよりも、それは一体魚がどのぐらいいるのかということの方が分かりやすいだろうという、想定からなります。なので、MSY をブリ類で目指す場合には、22.2 万トンの資源量を目指すと。限界管理基準値、リミットレファレンスポイントについては B リミットなんだけれども、この B リミットというのは、親魚の資源量が 6.9 万トンのことですと。また、もし 0.9 万トンを切ってくる場合には、これは禁漁水準、つまりフィッシャリー漁業自体を禁漁にするというラインを関係者に示します。その上で右側に先ほどもあった神戸チャートというのを示して、実際に今ブリの資源というのがどういうふうに変化してきているのか、変遷してきているのかということも合わせて示していきます。その上で、案として資源管理の目標を10年後に、MSY レベルを達成する確率を 50% と設けるとするならば、この3つのシナリオがありますよということを関係者に示します。実際にですね、これは2021年から2031年までの、管理目標管理基準値を達成させるために、大体平均の漁獲量がどのぐらいになっていくのかというものを示したものになります。例えば 92% の確率で10年後に目標管理基準値を達成する MSY を達成するためには 12.2 トン、9.8 トン、11.3 トンというように毎年どのぐらいの総漁獲量となっていくのかという数字で見せていくということを意図して作成されています。もちろんこうした魚種ごとのサイエンスコミュニケーションの向上というものがありつつも、シナリオの提示と選択肢の提供、それの丁寧な説明というのが常に求められています。で、その後にですね、ステークホルダーの参画を促すために、まずステークホルダー会合のためには、準備として資源管理手法検討会というものが行われます。そこで専門家や参考人から意見収集を行った上で、どういうふうにステークホルダーと対話をすべきかという重要項目について準備をした上で、ステークホルダー会合に参加をしています。で、これは水産庁のウェブサイトのスクリーンショットなんですけれども、実際にこれまでブリ類については2回のステークホルダー会合が実施されていて、その中で、共有された資料であったり議事録というものが、ウェブサイトから見られるようになっています。ですので、こういった意味ではいろいろなステークホルダー会合のプロセスであったり、どういうものが説明されたのかということが、これまで以上に以前とは違って、かなり透明性のあるプロセスへ転換していったということは言えるかと思います。一方で、ただこうした資料にやはり水産庁のウェブサイトの中で探し出すというのはなかなか大変な作業でして、透明性は設けているものの、やはりより分かりやすい、どこに資料があるのか、それを体系だって確認をしてもらうためには、まだまだ丁寧なやり取りというのが必要かなというふうには思っています。最後にまとめとして、日本の進捗と課題というところをまとめたいと思います。まず日本では資源の持続可能性を管理目標として設定をするということに移行できました。一方でですね、多様な魚種を対象とする日本の漁業では、資源評価をベースとした管理手法を進めるにあたってはですね、やはり急いでなかなか進められない、たくさんの魚種、たくさんのデータ、たくさんの資源評価、それをコミュニケーションするというプロセスにおいては、やはりキャパシティが限られているということは課題の一つかと言えます。また、ステークホルダーの参加プロセスを設けたということは一つの重要な向上した、改善された点だとは思うんですけれども、一方で、やはりインプットであったり、テクニカルコントロールを主体に自主管理を メインに行ってきた日本の中では、まだまだタックの設定というアウトプットコントロールへの移行が大きな議論になっています。そういった意味では、新しい資源管理の在り方への理解浸透の促進というのは、これからも図られるべきで、先ほどシャナさんが共有されていたような、NGO であったり、そういった専門性を持つ第三者組織の重要性というのが、日本でもどんどん増してきているというふうに私は見ています。最後に、小規模零細漁業が多い沿岸地域で発展してきた自主管理というシステムと、こうしたタックのような国における一括した資源管理の仕組みというのをどううまく連携させていくのかということが日本では課題になりますけれども、これはアジア圏の中では共通の課題なのではないかなというふうに思っております。そういう意味では今後の日本でどういう経験をするのか、どういう苦労をするのか、どういう成果が生まれるのかっていうのは、この地域の中で共有可能な一つのレッスンズ&ラーン教訓になり得るというふうに私の方では期待をしています。太平洋クロマグロの資源管理の事例なんていうのは非常に多様な漁業種類があって、日本全国で魚が取られる場合にどうやって国で管理をするのかと非常に苦労をしてきた案件にはなるんですけれども、こういったものが今後の発展に非常に貢献するレッスンズ&ラーンになっていくのではないのかなというふうに思っております。以上で私からの発表は終わらせていただきます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Aiko-san, thank you so much for your presentation. We have about 7 minutes for questions and answers. Currently, I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions for any of our 3 speakers today, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. Otherwise, please reach out to me through the email that was provided to you in the invite, and I can then forward any of the questions you may have to the speakers. And if you would like any of their presentations, you can also reach out to me and I can see whether or not these presentations may be shared. Shayna's presentation, most of the information that she presented can be found on her website. And Shayna, if you are in the chat, please feel free to write your website in the chat so people may visit. And of course, for those in Japan, you know Seafood Legacy, and you're more than welcome to reach out to Aiko. I assume many of you probably already know Aiko-san. With that, I would like to say thank you for joining us today on Harvest Strategies. And I hope that you learned a lot, and we hope that you'll come back for other presentations in the future on topics such as this. Thank you so much.
Gunther, do you have can I just interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
This is Lord. I have sent a question, unfortunately, directly to Shayna.
Oh,
so I didn't realize I was going to the chat. So I just sent her one. Maybe she can answer that, read it, and then answer it. And then I also am going to send one to Eric, if there's time. And again, I would send it directly to him. I'm not savvy with this whole process, so bear with me, please.
Well, Shayna, if you can you read the question so our interpreters can translate it, and then feel free to answer it.
Yes, and thank you for the question, Gerard. The question is, while MSC is clearly an important tool for developing a harvest strategy, their development and implementation can take years. In my experience, at least 5 years. Can you elaborate on the time generally required to effectively develop and implement an MSC, and what can be done in the interim to develop a harvest strategy until an MSC has been developed? And that is an excellent question, Dr. DiNardo, and something that I alluded to in my final slide, but didn't elaborate on much. there are these MSE software packages now that can make the process much more efficient and have the simulation testing done in a modeling software. And so as long as there is a clear timeline and the commission, if it's an international, if it's at an RFMO, if the commission has an agreed, facilitator for the process, a science management dialogue group, a clear work plan, and then, uses some sort of pre-established MSE framework that they then tailor to the specifics of their fishery, the process can be much more efficient. For example, for Greenland halibut at NAFO in the Northwest Atlantic, they did not use an MSE software package, but they had all of those other elements in place, and they developed, adopted, and implemented a harvest strategy using a full MSE in about a year and a half. And so if they had used a software package, it would be even less. For some of the domestic fisheries, they are going through the entire process with the manager and stakeholder engagement, as well as a full MSE in 6 months to 1 year. International management usually takes longer because of the management meeting cycle and all of the other issues that RFMOs are dealing with, but it can be done quite quickly. If it takes longer, and certainly some MSEs at the RFMO level have taken 5 years, like you say, or even longer. Southern bluefin, it was the first one that took 10 years. There are some other tools that could be used in the interim. NPFC, for example, I mentioned, adopted an interim harvest control rule for Pacific Sari this year. That is not based on a full MSE yet. It was instead some simulation modeling, but not a full MSE. So that is an option to get that pre-agreed rule in place, even if it's not going to be able to account for uncertainty, for example, like a full MSE would. So I hope that answers your question, but what I really want to emphasize is that as we've learned and developed these tools more, MSE really doesn't need to take more than a couple years, even for international fisheries at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Shauna. That exactly does answer my question, and it's nice to know that I wasted a lot of my time in my life putting these things together.
Yes, I believe it.
I did submit a question to Eric, so perhaps he has time to answer that.
We have, looks like 2 questions here. If we can, there's a question also from a Japanese participant. If we can quickly answer that and then go back to yours. I understand that we are now over time, however, so if it's okay, we will answer this one Japanese question, and then Gerald, we can communicate and get you in contact with Eric, if that's okay.
Thank you for your question. I didn't notice that Gerard also attended Gerard actually is also an MSE expert. So his question is, what would you consider to be the major bottlenecks when developing, implementing, and enforcing harvest strategy do current harvest strategy in Taiwan effectively account for uncertainty, and if not, what changes should be made? I think I'm not in a good position to answer your first question. But to the second question, I can say that the biggest problem in Taiwan is for us, not many people understand what is harvest strategy and what is the MSE. We know the terms, but we are getting more people understand the term, but the meaning of the harvest strategy or how to implement it is still has a long way to go for them to understand clear. So I think if we want to make changes, we need to have a more I may say Chinese speaking workshop to express convey their kind of the benefit of their harvest strategies, and to persuade people to understand it is not so difficult. You know, in Taiwan, many local fisheries has not effective management, even in a traditional way. So if you request to have to conduct to develop a harvest strategy, it probably will a long way to go. I mean, it's very difficult for them to understand, to agree. So I think to express to explain the idea is most important thing for the time being. Yeah. And then your first question, I may need some time to consider. Sorry about that. Thank you. But I take this chance to say apologies to all the participants who speak Korean or Chinese or Japanese. I didn't thought my Chinese need to translate it into English, then translate it into another languages. Yeah. So I'm sorry I speak too fast. I trying to explain my idea in 15 minutes, but I didn't thought that I need to be slower for the interpretation. Sorry about that.
Professor, it's no problem. I think the interpreters did a good job at getting your point across, and I think a lot of people learned from your presentation. So I think no worries there. I know we have one more question from Usui-san. I think if we can just answer it very quickly. I don't know who would want to answer it. Aiko-san, and if you are still here, perhaps you can answer it quickly, although I assume you've spoke to Usui-san about this many times. But please inform the group.
では私からまずもし他の登壇者の方もあればと思うんですけれども、すごく重要な指摘だと思っています。チャン先生の発表の中でも記録として上がってくるデータは資源評価に生かしつつも、誰かが提出しない、どのぐらい誰が取ってるかわからないものというのは、非常にこういう枠組みを設定する上では不確実性リスクみたいなことを検討していたとしても、非常にハーベストストラテジーをステークホルダーが理解するための大きなリスクになり得ると思っています。そういう意味ではどうして自分たちだけが守らなければいけないのかというところを理解いただくためには、IUU 漁業というものを一緒に合わせて徹底的に排除していく、コンプライアンス状況を上げていくということはとても重要だと思っています。そうですね、どこの国やステークホルダーがというところでは、コンプライアンスをどのぐらい守らないのかというレベル感にもあると思いますけれども、おそらく、最近の動向はマグロ類なんかであれば、シャナさん、ミラーさんだったり、チャン先生の方がもしかしたらご知見を持っていらっしゃるかもしれません。
I do want to be conscious of the time. We are 6 minutes over our allotted period that we planned for this presentation. I think there are still a lot of comments that could be made regarding this issue of who are the countries or the stakeholders that are supporting IUU fishing, and some of that is explicitly going out and trying to purposely purchase this IUU catch, and some of it is due to lack of transparency, the lack of proper fisheries management, and so on. And there's a lot of conversation that can be had about that. So I just want to be conscious of our time and thank everybody for joining us. Usui-san, of course, feel free to contact me to talk more about that if you'd like. I know I'll be seeing you soon in London, but thank you everybody for joining today, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Gunther.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the efforts.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everybody.